Hey everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about what are Terraform providers, how do you use them, where do they come from, and at last we will configure those providers in our Terraform configuration file, and we'll see live how do they behave when you configure them. Enough with the overview, let's get started. So what are Terraform providers? Providers are essentially plugins that Terraform uses to interact with your cloud providers such as AWS, Azure, or GCP. You must declare providers configuration so that Terraform could install those plugins and use them accordingly. Some of the providers would require additional configuration before they can be used. It depends on the provider. So what do essentially providers do? As I said it before, they are the plugins that help you interact with the providers. Once you are connected with your AWS or cloud providers, this would allow you to create the resources in those environment or whatever you have defined in your configuration. If you don't have a provider, you cannot manage the resources in your cloud providers environment, and each providers comes with a set of resource types and the data sources that the Terraform can manage. The resource types are essentially again the resources that you will be creating, and the data sources are something that the Terraform will pulls from your account so that it could make the modification as long as you have the proper configuration in place. Where do providers come from? Terraform Registry is the main directory where all these publicly available providers exist, and this is where the Terraform downloads and install the plugins from. There are like a different type of providers, official ones that are maintained and owned by HashiCorp, and the partner ones are that are written and maintained by their third party, but they have a partner relationship with HashiCorp, and then you have a community ones that are published by individual maintainers. And each provider has an extensive documentation available on how you create their resources and their respective arguments so that you could create the resources as you desire. Terraform Registry is the home for the documentation for different type of for a wide range of providers. When it comes to using providers, you gotta keep in mind that the providers are released separately from Terraform and they have their own version numbers. And in production environment, you may wanna constrain your Terraform provider with the acceptable provider version so that you don't get any surprises when the new one get released. To use providers resources, as I was saying before, you have to configure provider in your configuration. When it comes to providers configuration, it has two blocks that it relies on. The one is the required provider block, and then you have a provider block. The required provider block within the Terraform block is essentially tells Terraform that what provider it should download and its version. You're looking at the example configuration for my cloud provider, and it's specifying where it should download that plugin from and its version number. Each module should declare which version it requires so that Terraform could download it and install it for that particular module. Each provider has two identifiers, like a unique address, source address, and their local name. The local name is something that will your resources utilize whenever they're referring to a particular provider. When it comes to providers versions, they are developed as the functionality evolves. If you don't specify a version, Terraform would download the latest one. And if you're specifying a version, Terraform uses this dependency log file, which ensures that you're using the consistent version wherever you run your code. So how do you install a provider? So basically you specify in your configuration file, and once you have specified what provider you want to download, then you initialize your working directory. Providers would get download it from Terraform Registry and load it into your local folder. And like I was saying before, the dependency log file would ensure that it always installs the same provider version for that particular configuration. The second part of the configuration is provider configuration. Some providers require configuration with your endpoint URL. You may have to specify the regions and additional settings, and all this configuration must be declared in your root module so that your child module could use that configuration. You're looking at the example configuration for a Google provider. You use the provider block and then you specify its argument that are required for Google provider. Terraform is smart enough to read your sensitive information from environment variables so that you don't have to specify the sensitive so you don't have to specify your credentials within your configuration, and that is something against the Terraform best practices as well. I will demonstrate what I mean by that when we will configure our AWS provider. Whenever you're declaring provider configuration, you could also use expressions to declare certain values for your provider, which means if you have variable defined before you're defining your provider configuration, you could refer to a value from that variables to your provider's configuration. Now let's go to Terraform Registry, the home page for the documentation, and explore that one. So you add the Terraform registry.terraform.io, and this is the home where the Terraform downloads the plugin from. If I go to browse providers, here on the left, I could filter based on the tiers, official ones, partner or community one. AWS is the official one that is maintained by HashiCorp. So let's go in here to this provider, and here's where the versions are, different type of versions. The new one that released recently 4 days ago, and if you want to use the previous one, you just select that version, and if they're not specifying here, you could click on view all versions, and this will give you the list of previous versions for AWS provider. So this is with the providers, and then it has extensive documentation on the resource types, and the resources is managed with AWS provider. Each provider would have its own documentation. If I go back to Azure would have its own documentation, and the resources is managed. And so you just gotta, whatever the provider you're configuring it, to go to its respective documentation. So we are using AWS. We're gonna go in here. Now let's configure our providers. The documentation even tells you on how you can use this provider. So on the top right corner, telling you copy this code and then run Terraform init, and it would initialize and downloads the AWS plugin for you. So let's quickly do that. So I do have this Terraform file main.tf. On the right hand side is terminal where I would run the commands as required, and this is where we'll be demonstrating the whole thing. So now I've copied as recommended by documentation, copy the code. Now I'm gonna run Terraform init. What? Can't type today. This doesn't take too long, and this Terraform init command would read my configuration and read the lines in my code, and it knows that it's supposed to download AWS plugin, and it source tells you where it should download it from, and then the version tells what version it should download. As you could see it here while the command was executing, that it was finding this plugin and then it installed it, and once the plugin is installed, it sits in .terraform folder. You can check it going to this folder, and you could see it here. This is a plugin that Terraform has downloaded. It also generates the .terraform.log.htcl file, which ensures that what version it should always, this configuration should use. If I had specified the older version, this file would ensure that whenever I run the Terraform code next time or trying to create the resources, it stick to that particular version. So that is with what Terraform, when it comes to downloading the plugin for Terraform. But how about, like, me configuring my AWS account so that Terraform could create the accounts? And that's where the provider blocks comes in, and each provider would have a different type of required arguments. If I coming in here for AWS, and if I go to my documentation, I could go to the overview, the documentation, and the first page with the AWS provider, it tells me that what I need to configure. If I want to configure a provider, there are different type of arguments available that you could specify to connect to your account. You could even specify the access key and the secret key so that it talks to that particular AWS account. But that's not something that you want to do. You don't want to specify your access key within your configuration. Terraform is smart enough that it could read whatever you have configured in your terminal or in your CLI. So if I do, now the Terraform AWS configure list, it would read this. These are environment variables that are stored in my terminal, and this is what Terraform would read to connect to my AWS account. And even if I don't specify anything within the provider configuration, the Terraform is going to read this information from environment variable and create the resources. Let's quickly do that before I specify any values for providers block. Okay, so I've just copied this code. This is creating the resource type AWS instance, which is again EC2 instance, and I'm specifying its argument, what AMI, and the type of the instance. Now, if I run Terraform plan or Terraform apply, it would create this resources in this environment. As I saying, it would use the access key from my environment variable and secret key as well, and then the region where it would create the resources. So I could just run Terraform apply and the resource would get created. I just have to specify yes. Okay, so I'm getting the error, so that is telling me that it is invalid AMI. Okay, so I need to update the AMI. Okay, so I've just updated the AMI, and I believe this is the right one. And this should create my EC2 instance in US East 1 region, because that is what is configured in my AWS profile, and that's something that that's where the Terraform is reading my credentials from. So let's go to my AWS account, and as you could see, I'm in US East, my default region, which is configured there. Coming to my EC2 portal, as you could see here that it is the new instances being created, and the my instance, that's the name that I specified in my configuration. And yeah, so by default it created in whatever is in my configured in my profile. Now let's play with the provider's configurations and change some things and see if I could deploy my resources in different regions. If I would have specified here region to, I don't know, US West 2. Yeah, so now Terraform's gonna override what's in my configuration versus what it reads from the environment variable. So Terraform, if I try to create the resource now, it would create the resource in US West 2 region. So let's do that. Since, as you may be aware that the AMI is varies from region to region, so I have to update the AMI for this region. So let's update this, and now if I run Terraform apply again, it would accept yes, and now it's not gonna create the resource in US East 1 by default. That's something that is configured in my environment variable or in my configurations. If I go to US West 2, yeah, so as you could see here, the new instance is popping up, and this is just to demonstrate that, you know, whatever you declare in your configuration file, that is what is prioritized over what's in your environment variable. If you don't specify anything in your configuration, and the Terraform would try to read it from your environment variable. Okay, so now let's get back to the slides. So let's talk about the provider aliases, right? So by default, if you're coming back to the configuration, once you declare this, all the resources that you'll be creating below, they will use this configuration and deploy your resources in region 2. But if for instance, I may have a scenario where I want to create some of the resources in US East 1 and some of the resources in US West 2, that's where you would use the aliases. So I would do this, declare the provider block again. So to do that, you have to declare the provider block again and then describe alias argument, and you could just name it anything. I'm just gonna name it West, and for this one we're just gonna leave it as it is. So if I try to create resources, any like this resources, this would by default pick this one that has no aliases defined its argument, and this is considered as a default provider. If I want to use this provider and this region, I would have to declare it in my resource. So for do that, I would just use the provider document and then use AWS and the name of it and the name of the alias, and that's how it would this resource would ensure that it uses this configuration, which in our case is only the region, which is the different one. Okay, so that's what we're seeing it here. When it comes to default provider, as I was saying you, the provider block without aliases defined in it is considered as a default configuration for that providers. Resources do not set the provider's metadata, will use the provider's configuration, whatever the default configuration is. Whenever you're referring to the different configuration, as what we just saw in our configuration, you specify the resource and then you declare this provider's meta argument, and then you refer to what provider that you want to use and specify its alias. Now, talking about the dependency log file, as we've seen it through that it kind of tracks your provider's dependency, and it's named like Terraform log.hcl as what we just saw it here in our configuration, and it's all generated by default or automatically when the Terraform init runs, and it's also updated automatically whenever the new version comes out, and it would update it accordingly. If you have specified the version that you want to restrict your configuration to, it would ensure that it sticks to that version as well. The Terraform dependency file uses this checksum verification. So whenever it reruns, you reinitializes, it verifies its integrity and authenticity of provider using checksums, and ensures that your newly downloaded plugin hasn't been tampered with. And with that, that's it with this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you find it useful. If you find it useful, please consider subscribing, liking this channel, and this will help me a ton. Thank you very much.